someone came to you and said, I'm a carpenter, but they didn't know anything about wood. They didn't know how to hold a hammer, or swing a hammer, or pound a nail, or saw lumber, or any of those kinds of things. What would you think?
My first question would be like, what's your definition of a carpenter?
Right. There you go. What is a carpenter? Right. What would you say a carpenter is?
Someone who constructs using materials.
Okay.
You can do it with steel, you can do it with concrete.
Right.
So it's someone who actually constructs.
Someone who actually constructs. Interesting, yeah. Well, Tim and I today were talking about what is a monk. Give me time and I'll figure out how to relate that to a carpenter. But I think it's, if I take a jab at it, it would be somebody who actually constructs a life of prayer and work, devotion, for their whole life. It's a commitment that's made. Yeah, I like that. Someone who actually constructs a life of prayer and work and devotion. For their whole life. That's their commitment.
Been a monk for a long time.
There are many throughout history who have lived the life of a monk, and one of them I'm holding in my hand, whose name is Thomas Merton. And he's written this little book. It was one of his favorite books that he wrote, and that says a lot. Merton was not easy to please, and especially on himself. He was hard on himself. So for him to say he really, really liked this book that he wrote means something. And it's called The Wisdom of the Desert. The Wisdom of the Desert. Translations from the Verba Seniorum, the words of the elders. And I'll just read you a bit of the back, and then we can pass it around and read bits of the interior. The Wisdom of the Desert was one of Thomas Merton's favorite among his own books, surely because he had hoped to spend his last years as a hermit. The personal tone of the translations, the blend of reverence and humor so characteristic of him, show how deeply Merton identified with the legendary authors of these sayings and parables, the 4th century Christian fathers who sought solitude and contemplation in the deserts of the Near East. The hermits of Skeet, who turned their backs on a corrupt society, remarkably like our own, becoming even more so, had much in common with the Zen masters of China and Japan, and Father Merton made his selection from them with an eye to the kind of impact produced by the Zen world. In fact, says Daniel Berrigan, Thomas Merton does not so much introduce the fathers of the desert, he stands among them, in their midst, one of them. So I thought we would just begin to look at some of the introduction that he wrote, Thomas Merton that is, to his book, The Wisdom of the Desert. Most of the book is a collection of sayings that come from those that dwelt in the desert. But I thought we would just read Thomas Merton tonight, see how far we get, if we want to talk about it. I'll start. Maybe a paragraph.
I need to go get my glasses.
Ah, okay. We'll wait for you. In the 4th century AD, the deserts of Egypt, Palestine, Arabia, and Persia were peopled by a race who had left behind them a strange reputation. They were the first Christian hermits who abandoned the cities of the world to live in solitude. Why did they do this? The reasons were many and various, but they all can be summed up in one word: the quest for salvation. And what was salvation for them? Certainly it was not something they sought in mere exterior conformity to the customs and dictates of the social group. In those days, people had become keenly conscious of the strictly individual character of salvation. Society, which meant quote-unquote pagan society, limited by the horizons and prospects of life in this world, was regarded by them as a shipwreck from which each single individual had to swim for his life. That's quite an image, isn't it? I mean, to consider the world we live in as a shipwreck, and we have to, man overboard. What's the phrase that's used when each person has to just focus on his own life? There's a phrase that's used, a way of describing it.
To each their own.
Something like that. Something like that. Anyway.
Every man for
Every man for himself. Yeah. Yeah, the ship's going down. Every man for himself, right? And that's how Merton says the world was viewed back then. By these folk, a shipwreck from which each single person had to swim for his very life. We need not stop here to discuss the fairness or accuracy of this view. What matters is to remember that it was, in fact, their view. These were people who believed that to let oneself drift along passively, accepting the tenets and values of what they knew as society, was purely and simply a disaster. The fact that the emperor was now Christian, remember, in the 4th century, Emperor Constantine declared Christianity the official religion and became a Christian himself. The fact that the emperor was now Christian and that the world was coming to know the cross as a sign of military imperial power only strengthened them in their resolve to leave that world behind and to enter into another kind of society, you could say. It should seem to us much stranger than it does, this paradoxical flight from the world that attained its greatest dimensions. And in parentheses he says, I almost said frenzy, when the world became quote-unquote Christian. So Merton is obviously not signing up, to this belief that the world was Christian. He's just saying that they adopted the Christian religion and used it to conquer and exploit and control people. He would not say that they became Christians, but they adopted the Christian religion and used it. These people seem to have thought, as a few rare modern thinkers do, that there is really no such thing as a Christian state. They seem to have doubted that Christianity and politics could ever be mixed to such an extent as to produce a fully Christian society. In other words, for them, the only Christian society was spiritual and extra-mundane, outside this world, the mystical body of Christ. These were surely extreme views, and it is almost scandalous to recall them in a time like ours, when Christianity is accused on all sides of preaching negativism and withdrawal. and of having no effective way of meeting the problems of the age. I don't think Merton would have written that had he been alive today. I think with the rise of Christian nationalism, he would have something else to say about that. Because certainly the rise of the Christian right, Christian nationalism, does attempt to say we can meet the problems of the age and have a Christian country. Merton would disagree radically, and but he didn't live to see that. But let us not be too superficial. The Desert Fathers did, in fact, meet the problems of their time, in the sense that they were among the few who were ahead of their time and opened the way for the development of a new society, a new person. They represent what modern social philosophers, Jaspers and Mumford, call the emergence of the axial man, the forerunner of the modern personalist man. He's using language that's male-gendered. The 18th and 19th centuries, with their pragmatic individualism, degraded and corrupted the psychological heritage of this axial man, with its debt to the Desert Fathers and other contemplatives, and prepared the way for the great regression. And here's where he's very much of a social commentator. Prepared the way for the great regression to the herd mentality that is taking place now. I think he would emphasize it even more today, the herd mentality, people being swept up and losing their individuality, their personhood, and like the story we shared the other night with Ogma, losing their soul, in effect. He would say that, I have no doubt. So, Barb, flight, bottom of the page.
The flight of these men to the desert was neither purely negative nor purely individualistic. They were not rebels against society. True, they were in a certain sense, in quotes, anarchists, and it will do no harm to think of them in that light. They were men who did not believe in letting themselves be passively guided and ruled by a decadent state, and who believed that there was a way of getting along without slavish dependence on accepted conventional values. But they did not intend to place themselves above society. They did not reject society with proud contempt, as if they were superior to other men. On the contrary, one of the reasons why they fled from the world of men was that in the world men were divided into those who were successful and imposed their will on others, and those who had to give in and be imposed upon. The Desert Fathers declined to be ruled by men, but had no desire to rule over others themselves, nor did they fly from human fellowship. The very fact that they uttered these words of advice to one another is proof that they were eminently social. The society they sought was one where all men were truly equal, where the only authority under God was the charismatic authority of wisdom, experience, and love. Of course, they acknowledged the benevolent hierarchical authority of their bishops, but the bishops were far away and said little about what went on in the desert until the great Origenist conflict at the end of the 4th century.
What the fathers sought most of all was their own true self in Christ. And in order to do this, they had to reject completely the false formal self fabricated under social compulsion in the world. They sought a way to God that was uncharted and freely chosen, not inherited from others who had mapped it out beforehand. They sought a God whom they alone could find, not one who was given in a set, stereotyped form by somebody else. Not that they rejected any of the dogmatic formulas of the Christian faith. They accepted and clung to them in their simplest and most elementary shape. But they were slow, at least in the beginning, in the time of their primitive wisdom, to get involved in theological controversy. Their flight to the arid horizons of the desert meant also a refusal to be content with arguments, concepts, and technical verbiage.
We deal here exclusively with hermits. There were also Selenites in the desert, Cenobites by the 100 and by the 1,000, living in common life in enormous monasteries like the one founded by Saint Pachomius at Tabina. Among these, there were social order, almost military discipline. Nevertheless, the spirit was still very much a spirit of personalism and freedom, because even the Cenobite knew that his rule was only an exterior framework, a kind of scaffolding, with which he was helped himself build a spiritual structure of his own life with God. But the hermits were in every way more free. There was nothing to which they had to conform, except the secret, hidden, inscrutable will of God, which might differ from notably from one cell to another. It is very significant that one of the first of these verba, number 3, is one in which the authority of Saint Anthony is abducted for what is the basic principle of desert life, that God is the authority, and that apart from his manifest, well, there are few or no principles. Therefore, whatever you see your soul to desire according to God, do that thing, and you shall keep your heart safe.
It's a good place to stop. Thank you. So what do you think? Merton's description of the very first desert dwellers.
So it sounds very familiar.
Ah, yeah,
Yeah, I can relate to it almost exactly.
yeah.
Seems like an ongoing issue too.
Mm-hmm. In what ways, Michael?
Well, in ways that people who have pride, who have money, or high standards with other people, consider themselves more valuable than others, as they're better or can have better choices for everyone. In reality, you know, God has always told us to do what we feel He's telling us to do. You know, so we're not supposed to go with the crowd. We're supposed to do what He wants.
Mm.
But even in today's world, you have that, you know, people trying to override, you know, what we're being told by God to be like and to do. You know, they don't like when you go against them. But it seems like it's always ongoing.
Mm.
Moses and the Pharisees, you know, same issues. Jesus with the scribes. They're trying to overrule and say they knew more than him. It just seems to be an ongoing thing for history of humankind.
Any other thoughts? So Merton is introducing the beginnings, in a general way, the beginnings of monastic life as we know it. There's a lot we don't know. In fact, most of it we don't know, I'd say. But what little bit we understand, it started with some people who felt a great discontent with the way things were in society. And they chose to live a different kind of life away from that, particularly the city in their case, and went to the desert, literally to the desert, the wilderness, kind of like John the Baptist, you know. If you can imagine hundreds of John the Baptists, even thousands of them in the desert, that's kind of what it was like. And by the way, Merton doesn't mention women, but there were women there too. And that's a whole nother story. But there were men and women. And they chose to leave the city and live, as Merton says, a solitary life. And as we understand it, it wasn't completely solitary. You know, they did see each other from time to time, and even gathered together to celebrate what they would call the Eucharist, the Mass, gatherings. You know, there's problems with coyotes or foxes or whatever. We've got to deal with this stuff. But for the most part, they began their monastic life living most of their life alone. Yeah. And Merton, I think, had a special affection for them because, as he says in other writings, you know, he began to live more of his own life as a hermit. That was really what he wanted. He lived in community for years, but he was always, according to his own description and his brother's, a problem. He was a rough edge, and I think toward the end of his life he realized that his life would be best, and he could best serve as a hermit. So I think he had great affection for these hermits, and that's what they were, who lived most of their life in a solitary way. And Tim and I were joking today about, you know, imagining what must have been like, because, as Merton says, there were at one point thousands of them in the desert. It's like, okay, thousands, that's a lot of people in the desert, you know, and each one has their little plot, you know. You can just imagine, you know, the new hermit moving in. Where should I set up my camp? Not here, you know. There's too many of us here already. Move on, keep going, you know. I'm sure that happened. You know, up in the hills there's a few caves that are empty. You go up there, okay. It must have been kind of comical in some ways. But they did have this bond, even though they didn't see each other a lot. Maybe that's why they had such a bond, I don't know. But they developed a life. And at some point, and he mentions, I can't remember who it was right now, I think it was Pachomius, who is attributed as bringing together the group for one of the first kind of communities. And the word is Cenobitic. They were Cenobites. They lived together in community. Prior to that, you know, they were mostly, you know, off themselves, by themselves, alone, occasional bumping into each other, but not really living together in small space. But at some point, there was a decision made, nobody knows exactly when, that they needed to band together. They needed to create little groups, and sometimes large groups, but groups, for whatever reasons. And they did. And so they went from being hermits to being Cenobites, living together in a common life in one space. And that's really the beginning of the modern Western monastic communities. Yeah. But I think, as we were reading, it's pretty clear that what they wanted to do, even as they chose to live together under one roof or in one small space, they wanted to maintain that individual fire, that individual burning of the heart for God, and that depth of experience and encounter with the divine as individuals, right? Individuals. And yeah. And so that became, I think, part of the challenge, not just getting along with Joe Schmo, who's now part of my life every day, but also maintaining what they found as individuals alone in the desert. Because from all indications, it was a very intense life, and one of depth and beauty, rich interior life, and they didn't want to lose that. When they moved in together, it's kind of like you hear young couples saying, "Yeah, we're cool. We don't want to get married. We don't want to make that commitment because we're afraid we're going to lose that passion. We're going to lose that fire. And so we're cool. We're fine." That may be overly simplistic, but you know what I mean. So this is Martin's introduction, and maybe tomorrow night we'll continue on and begin to read some of the words, and that's what's used, is the words from these elders. Does anybody remember any of those words as you've may have read some of them? I thought that might be a good way to close. Any particular words that stay in your mind from one of these desert dwellers?
Are you asking about like the virtues?
I'm asking anything you might remember that one of them said.
Oh.
If not, I think I have one.
Yes,
You do remember one?
there is one. Somebody went to, I think it was Anthony,
Uh-huh.
and there was a fire in his little cottage,
Uh-huh.
and the young person, or the person who came to him at any rate, asked, what more he could do. And Anthony said, held his hands up so that the fire shined through them. And he said, well, you can become all flame.
There you go. That's a good one. You could become all flame. Yeah. That's the kind of thing that they would offer. And whether that young person understood or got it, that word from the elder was something that everybody sought when they went into the desert to visit one of them. Give us a word. Give us a word of life. Yeah, so that's a good one. We'll close there. We'll close with a song. close of this day, we give you thanks, great lover of this world. May we grow and deepen in your love and become fire. May it be so.